awful lot of police officers join up fairly well motivated and perhaps with the right set of values, and it's terribly, terribly difficult to hold to those once you understand what happens in your department. I can remember vividly the first night on night duty as a police constable in Kent when I said I would not write a false statement. And everyone else left the room, and eventually the sergeant comes in and talks to me and says, PC Sparrow, do you know what you're doing? And I said, I think so. And he said, good, and walked out. And from that day forward, 4 on my section refused to work with me because I wouldn't lie. And 2 others asked to work with me. Thank you very much, Marcy. Thank you all for coming, especially on such a beautiful afternoon. Let me just correct one small thing. This is my 8th book, but I've never ever done a book event at a bookstore before, so this is entirely new to me. I'm not entirely sure of the format. I think my job is mostly to let you ask questions and let me know what's on your mind and at least explain why I wrote this book. My very first book was about the police profession, and that was in 1990. It was called Beyond 911, A New Era for Policing. And what it described now 26 years ago is the reform ideas that became conventional wisdom during the 1990s. That was the advent of community-oriented policing and problem-oriented policing as taught by Professor Goldstein and others. All my other work has been much more broadly on risk control and harm reduction tasks in government generally, but it did seem time to come back and take a look at the state of policing because there was a national debate precipitated. It began in the summer of 2014, 2 events within 3 weeks got everybody's attention. Eric Garner in New York City, who died shortly after apparently being held in a stranglehold, and officers standing around appeared to take little or no heed of his request for medical attention or his need for it. And then Michael Brown in Ferguson, a young black man shot dead by police there. That began the American nationwide debate. It led to demonstrations in cities way beyond those that were actually directly involved. The clear focus was not only the persistence of racial disparity or the appearance of it in the criminal justice system, but the extraordinary levels of violence and killings by American police. So while all of that is happening, I'm thinking to myself, well, a lot of this is the peculiarly American problems, the 2 of them, racial disparity and police violence. They intersect, of course, when it's a black man killed by a white officer, most obviously. But what really was the trigger for me to gather my thoughts on the state of policing, not just in America but worldwide, was when I read the Civil Rights Inquiry report. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division produced a 104-page report on the state of the Ferguson Police Department in Missouri. And it was astonishing to me in 2 regards. First of all, I had no idea what it was that would drive policing in Ferguson. It turns out to be the generation of revenue for the town from traffic citations. Everything was geared around that. They had the clearest single performance imperative was the budget contribution to be raised through enforcement. And the second thing that jumped out at me was when I get to the recommendations section, and it says, we recommend that the Ferguson, Missouri Department explore and implement community and problem-oriented policing. And that's in 2015. Now, those ideas were conventional wisdom back in the 1990s, so for 25 years, what has been happening? That's the question to which I thought I should address myself. And I've done it deliberately in a way that is global rather than focusing on these 2 specific American issues, because I believe that the profession globally has been somewhat handicapped. And that these reform ideas, powerful as they are, have somehow failed to thrive. So this is an inquiry into why that might be. Those two incidents, one in Ferguson, Missouri, which has 54 officers, and one in New York City, which has 34,000 officers, lots of folk will say, well, what on earth might they have in common? They are poles apart. Well, they do have one thing in common. I'm just going to read you a very short piece here, a paragraph. Strange as it may sound, even though the NYPD and the Ferguson Police Department had settled on quite different central imperatives, I should pause and tell you what the New York City one is, a more plausible one for police, the reduction in the reported crime rates. Absolutely central focus in NYPD. Even though they'd settled on quite different central imperatives, the fact that they each had a single central imperative, strongly emphasized and quite quantitative in nature, leads both departments into similarly dangerous waters. A dominant focus on one dimension of performance suppresses other legitimate concerns. A focus on ends, if not matched by effective control on means, can lead to behaviors that are unwise, risky, or illegal. Officers who perform well in achieving numerical goals may be rewarded or promoted even when the legitimacy or legality of the means they use to get those results is questionable. The organizational culture might even end up making heroes and heroines of those who, quote, are prepared to do whatever it takes, close quote, to meet ambitious targets and to make their bosses and organizations look good. Now this management phenomena focusing too closely on one central imperative and having that drive an organization producing all kinds of behaviors that may be risky, illegal, or just unwise. That's extremely well known and has been written about for over 50 years in the private sector and public sector managerial literature. If they have anything in common, that might be it. Just to take a very quick look at the what might be the hiccups in the maturing of these two core ideas. Perhaps I shouldn't assume that everybody's an expert on police strategy. What are these ideas? Community policing exploits the power of partnerships. It's a very straightforward notion to say, profound in its implications for a department. It says basically police and community should work together to set the agenda for public safety, and then they should work together to achieve it. Problem-oriented policing is a little different, but it goes with it. This exploits the power of thoughtfulness and analysis. It's based mostly on the work of Professor Goldstein, who says policing is more effective if it pays attention to the underlying issues and trends and patterns that produce transgressions and calls for service, rather than simply processing the cases or the violations one by one and after the fact. Again, easily said, profound in its consequences. What might have stopped these ideas from maturing? Just a few ideas. There's a longer list in the book. First of all, a lot of departments in implementing community policing adopted the rhetoric and did nothing different. Some went a little bit further and emphasized specific tactics like putting police officers on foot or on bicycles or even motorcycles and occasionally horses and calling that community policing. Many departments isolated the imperative for community policing in small dedicated units, which left the rest of the department free to carry on as normal. Many organizations that took it more seriously in the early days created a one-sided deal. They wanted communities to act as the eyes and ears for intelligence gathering purposes for the police to help them in their traditional professional crime fighting agenda. Like all one-sided deals, it's unstable. So that had to be replaced in the end with either disappear or be replaced with a two-sided deal or more obvious benefits for the community. And then a strange hiccup comes with 9/11. And as the country turns its attention to domestic security and counterterrorism, police now become a part of a third network. They were already part of two networks. They had always been a part of the criminal justice system with its focus on incapacitation and rehabilitation of offenders. Then with the focus on quality of life in the major cities, police had become part of a different network, municipal government, and the delivery of services. And often they would be the first point of call because they had a well-known telephone number, but would make a lot of referrals to other agencies of municipal government. With the advent of counterterrorism as a focus, local police become part of a national network based on intelligence and security, and that does a couple of things. First of all, the national security agenda competes for attention and resources with more local agendas. And second, it distorts the nature of community relationships that you might have. Yes, of course, in counterterrorism, good quality police community relationships are important, but for a rather different reason than for provision of local safety and security. We're going to pay particular attention to those communities most likely to be the source of any kind of extremism or violence. And the nature of the relationship is oriented towards that national agenda rather than towards the local, ordinary neighborhood needs. Problem solving, for its part, I've spent much of my life teaching other regulatory agencies, environmental protection and tax and transportation, safety and security, about the general value of this idea in the risk control domain. Police, as a profession, have a habit of replacing complex ideas with simplistic substitutes, which is very sad to watch. The first thing that happened quite broadly is that problem solving became a question of style for beat officers. In other words, it's pushed all the way down to the very lowest levels of the department. It becomes a matter of professional style, and headquarters would never interfere. And some beat officers can, of course, solve local beat problems. Turn out to be quite good at that. Others are terrible. But if you move this right down to the beat level, then you can only deal with beat level issues. And there are many crime issues that are nothing like beat level. They are citywide. They're concentrated on certain days of the week or special events. They straddle precinct boundaries. And so the mature problem-oriented department can organize itself around problems of any shape and size, not just at the beat level. Second thing, it is remarkable how stuck we are with what's called place-based version of problem-oriented policing. We had place-based policing long before we had computers. It's an idea that's over 100 years old. And before computers, the precinct commander would have a map on the wall with color-coded pins stuck in it for where crimes of different types had happened. And so geographic and temporal hotspots with a standard technical solution, which was directed patrol, flood the area with uniformed cops until the cluster goes away. That was absolutely well ingrained. And what Goldstein tried to say to the profession is, well, that's fine. You do quite well on problems that are genuinely geographic. But what about all the others? What about the ones that aren't concentrated that way, but are usefully concentrated some other way? For instance, a repeat offender who commits crimes all over the city, or a repeat victim who for some reason remains perpetually vulnerable and keeps on being victimized. It could be a class of victims who are vulnerable, for instance, single-manned convenience stores after the hour of 10 o'clock at night. It could mean whole new issues or social issues coming along that affect lots of people, like glue sniffing suddenly arrives in the junior schools or whatever it might be. He says some are around gangs and gang hostilities, some are around markets, some are organized around particular criminogenic commodities such as drugs, guns, stolen jewelry, high-value cars. And the versatile problem-oriented policing notion is that we should be able to recognize the genuine shape and size of each risk, organize around it once and at the right level, and apply a great deal of thoughtfulness and intelligence in fixing it. There's just some of the clues about what's gone wrong along the way. The underlying simmering issues of police violence don't seem to go away. We've had 2 reminders in the last 4 days. One, there was a chase 4 days ago and ended up in Nashua, New Hampshire. It involved the Massachusetts State Police and others. It was at least a 50-mile chase, and at the end of it, there is a Fox News helicopter hovering over the car when the driver climbs out of it. He climbs out I watched the video only yesterday, courtesy of the Guardian newspaper that does the most wonderful coverage for some reason of American policing issues. The driver climbs out very carefully and gingerly and lays down flat on the floor, hands down. He's obviously doing exactly what he's being told. And then you watch in amazement as, I don't know how many, 5, 7 officers all gather around and start punching and kicking and beating him. And a very curious moment, 90 seconds into this event, is one of the officers looks up in the sky and clearly is trying to figure out, oh, I thought this was a police helicopter. I describe another incident in the book. It happened a long time ago, and it was a very, very long chase in San Bernardino that ended with a very similar scene and a news helicopter hovering overhead that records, I forget how many, over 70 punches and kickers. And then the person's left, no attempt to provide medical assistance. And you think, what on earth is this about? Now I should point out that I am pro-cop. I was a police officer for 10 years in Britain. Yes, I knew officers that were corrupt and some that were brutal. Everybody knew on the section who was going to be the one involved in excessive violence. Everybody knows that inside the police department, but for some reason we tolerate them, and it's very difficult to hold them accountable even after the fact. But I have a great many friends that I love dearly who have given themselves and in some cases their lives to the mission of policing. They are humane, they are decent, they are courageous. They have done the most extraordinary things for the sake of public safety. But then I see these unbelievable behaviors and thank heavens for the viral videos. Because without them, I don't think we'd be having this discussion these days. We would not know anything like as much about what goes on when police think that the public are not watching. I do mention the case of Walter Scott, shot dead in April of 2015, just to show the importance, what we can learn and how best we learn it about why police violence persists in this country on a scale unprecedented in the civilized world. We learn more about the problem of police violence and how it can persist and might be covered up when a video only surfaces after some significant delay. That allows time for the police to provide their account of the incident before the video evidence is available, and possibly before they even know that any video recording exists. In the case of Walter Scott's death, it took more than 2 days before the video became available to authorities. Faidin Santana, who captured the shooting on his cell phone camera, initially kept quiet, fearing retribution. But he was angered when he heard the police account of the incident and made the recording available to Scott's family and to the media. Presumably, Officer Slager, in providing his initial account of the incident, had no idea that a video existed. He claimed that Scott, during a scuffle, reached for the taser on his, that is, the officer's belt, and that he, Slager, therefore felt his own life was in danger. He immediately gave an explanation over the police radio. Shots fired and the subject is down. He took my taser. Knowing that such transmissions are recorded, and hence putting his story on the record. And without the video evidence, that story might well have stood. But the video became public on April the 7th, showing Slager repeatedly firing at Scott as he ran away, 8 bullets. And Slager was arrested within a few hours and charged with murder. The video of Scott's shooting immediately went viral, of course, along with the revelations about Slager's original and clearly false account. For the general public, the case raises serious concerns about other police incidents not captured on video, where there is little or no objective evidence about what happened, and where officers provide similar justifications for shooting an unarmed person. The two most commonly offered are, if it's an unarmed person, he was reaching for my gun, or he was reaching for an object in his pocket and I assumed it might be a gun. So of course, some are perfectly justified and some are probably not, and we have very little idea about what kind of justifications or explanations are given routinely, because there are no national statistics on people shot or killed by police. Director Comey of the FBI has said a few times in the last few months that it is ridiculous and embarrassing that this country has no idea how many people are killed by police. The running official tally, based on a voluntary disclosure for justified homicides, was about 400 per year. But after these two events and with the debate unfolding, both the Guardian newspaper in London and the Washington Post began their own tallies. The end of the year totals for 2015, according to the Washington Post, 965 people shot dead by police. And according to the Guardian, 1,134 killed by the police. That includes other things other than shootings and deaths in police custody. 3 per day, roughly. More than double the official statistics. Ron Davis, head of the COPS office for the Department of Justice, has said, okay, killings may be justifiable, but many of them are nevertheless preventable. We need a serious concerted attempt to understand what kind of training, what kind of non-lethal force, what kind of cultural change is needed within American policing in order to drive these absurd numbers down to a reasonable level. There's no other nation on earth, at least not a democracy, that has equivalent numbers. Britain kills about 1 person a year on average, not 3 per day. Some people would say, well, that's not fair because they're not routinely armed. Canadian police are routinely armed. They kill an average of 8 per year. Germany, 6 per year. Australia killed 91 in 17 years. America killed that many in March 2015. What do I hope for this book? Not so much to solve the distinctively American problems, but to talk to the profession about where it's come to, why it got stalled, what it needs to really bring to fruition these important reform ideas. I want to remind the community what kind of policing it should be demanding. I want to help the police sort out the vast range of different methods and strategies that afloat in the air and get back to their central mission, which is the provision of public safety and security. In the latter chapters of the book, I've also told the profession that they need to re-examine their relationships, one with academia, which has done a lot less to help than it might have done. Second, with private security profession, which is more than double the size of the public police in this country. And third, my own personal wish, I wish the police would join in with all the other government agencies who are in the harm reduction or risk control business, and who have quite a fellowship of, it's mostly social regulators. Police, unfortunately, don't read anything, in my experience, unless it's about them. So there's very little in this book in terms of ideas and concepts, which I have not written several times elsewhere, but because it wasn't about the police and it didn't have a police car or a police officer on the front cover, police profession just somehow doesn't get to it. I think that's the isolation of this profession is highly regrettable. One of the things I would love to break open, and one of many things that's been holding them back. Thank you. If you came to ask questions, this is your moment. If you came to make a speech, this is your moment too. Speeches probably should be limited to a minute or two. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Address race, gender, sexuality when you were
In the English police? Not
in American, but either.
I have not worked as a police officer in the US. The equivalent issues in Kent police, I think, are much less charged than they are here, given the long history of civil rights movement and racial inequity. Our closest was that we had immigrant communities, not black, but Indian, Pakistani, and gypsies in particular. If there were sort of racial discrimination, it was against those groups.
Talk a bit about differences across cities in the U.S.
No, I don't really want to start singling out this city or that city, or to talk about one department.
Are there some cities that are doing a better job?
I'm sure there are. Yes, there's a. And big city policing is very different from general American policing, which is small scale, rural, much more distributed. In thinking about where community policing might get done naturally, lots of folks would say, well, if you're only a department of 15, 20 in a suburb or in a rural area, you might be doing it anyway more naturally. You might not need to have it introduced or formally managed the same way that you do when you've got 34,000 officers in a citywide setting. Yes, there are vast differences between the cultures of different big city forces. And I'm not going to name the ones I think are doing.
But you could tell us a little bit about why some have succeeded and others have failed, since that's a central topic of your book, as you described it.
I think I would start by examining the cultures and the attempts at reform and the effectiveness of, we're now looking at, given that the average tenure of a police chief in the US is about 3 years or less, 20, 25 years that we're looking for maturation of these ideas. You might have been through 5, 6, even 9 chiefs. Some of them are absolutely committed and very effective leaders. Some are committed and totally ineffective as leaders. Some are great leaders and don't have the right idea. We've got the whole slew. So part of it I would put down to leadership, part I would put it down to the persistent culture inside the organizations, which often turn out to be impermeable for many years, even to senior leadership reform efforts. And some have to do with the nature of the local community that they represent. Yes, sir.
Can you envision any institutions or processes for oversight of police at 2 different levels? One is at the level of what you're talking about, this institution of new ways of policing, and whether or not they've been properly put in place in any given department, but also in terms of investigations. I don't know if you followed the series of reports in the Washington Post by, I think his name Braca, maybe. He's been focusing on, I think in particular South Carolina. I think it's supposed to be a 4-part series, and he's done 2 so far, about, I forget the name of the organization, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division or something like that, that does investigations, supposedly does investigations of shootings within South Carolina. So it's supposed to be an independent body that is policing the local police forces within South Carolina.
Right.
But if you read his reports, they do a horrible job. I mean, it's more like they try to clear the police regardless of what
right.
happens. And so, I mean, can you imagine some kind of institution or process by which those types of investigations?
I think the Washington Post also has, I don't know if it's the same journalist, but they have looked back over 10 years at all of the recorded instances of police shootings that have ended up with an officer being charged. And it's an unbelievably low number. And virtually the only ones that ever end up with that are those where something quite peculiar and that can't be explained away is present. Often the video evidence, or all the bullets were in the back. So it comes through the forensic examination. There are lots of different arrangements, depends on whether you're a small town or big city and where you are. But I think that there's a very clear case to require an independent investigation. Whatever's happening in South Carolina, the norm in this country is still that a shooting will be investigated by the detectives from the same department. It's not like detectives are separate from patrol officers. They churn, they go in and out all the time. They're all good friends. This is woefully inadequate if you want any kind of independent accountability. The norm in British forces is that any such thing will be investigated by a neighboring force, not by the force itself. American jurisdictions are crazily messy. There's supposed to be over 18,000 separate law enforcement agencies, so there's probably not a standard structure, but that principle should require independent examination, not by your colleagues. And that's put forth by the President's Commission as one of their principal recommendations. I don't think it's close to happening yet, because of course we've got local politics.
You talked about policy, but you talked about training, but you mentioned recruitment. Is there something that's happening differently in the United States, for example, than is happening in any of the countries you cited with much lower instances of police violence?
Going back, I remember one of the first cases that we ever had written at the Kennedy School was about the Houston Police Department. Before Lee Brown took over as chief there, which was way back, 1980-something, they used to advertise for recruits nationally under the slogan, "Come to Houston where the action is." Now that, as a basis for recruiting police officers, raise your eyebrows. If not make you terrified to live there. I think it's got an awful lot better than that now. Curiously, I don't think, and there's a lot of attention, there's a requirement for a lot more officers to have college degrees in many city agencies. At the end of the day, I wouldn't trust recruiting to solve the cultural issues, because there is the process of acculturation. Once you're in the socialization, it's called the socialization of deviance. You soon discover what it is that your colleagues expect. And I forget there was a Mr. Cooper who I cite, a fabulous, he was president of the American Black Police Officers Association when there was a videotaped beating in Philadelphia, and he wrote an op-ed piece in the Philadelphia Inquiry. This is, I forget, 12, 13 years ago. And he said, everybody knows, you learn once you join the police about the code. And the code says, if somebody runs from police and therefore inconveniences you, at the end of the chase, you beat them up. The code also says that if a person has injured a police officer, they will be injured at least that badly before they get to the police station. And if they've killed a police officer, they won't get to the police station alive. Now, of course, you can say this is historical and we hope it's not widespread, but he's writing about it as if, it's absolutely standard in the acculturation of police officers. And I think an awful lot of police officers join up fairly well motivated and perhaps with the right set of values, and it's terribly, terribly difficult to hold to those once you understand what happens in your department. I can remember vividly the first night on night duty as a police constable in Kent when I said I would not write a false statement. And everyone else left the room, and eventually the sergeant comes in and talks to me and says, PC Sparrow, do you know what you're doing? And I said, I think so. And he said, good, and walked out. And from that day forward, 4 on my section refused to work with me because I wouldn't lie. And 2 others asked to work with me. which was quite interesting and a bit of a relief. And the most dangerous moment I had in the British police was when I turned in a senior officer for corruption. And then to CAB2, which was the Metropolitan Police Corruption Investigation Branch. And I got death threats from that. And that's from a fellow police officer. So standing up against what you confront is not straightforward or easy, but plenty do. The pervasive culture, I don't think, is quite where we'd want it to be yet. Recruitment alone, I don't think will fix it. Thank you very much, Marcy. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Let me give you a classic example. Just in the midst of the battles around Ferguson and Baltimore, the police abuse scandals, I had been a civil rights lawyer. It was not a surprise to me that police officers sometimes didn't tell the truth. And so when a police officer was on the stand, that was not something that was, I didn't assume he was lying. I didn't assume he was telling the truth. I could envision that he was coloring what he was saying. Some of my colleagues who had had no experience ever as a criminal defense lawyer or no experience outside of big firm practice couldn't imagine that a police officer would lie.